You have a son?" Ronan's voice was low, deadly calm, but inside, his world just shattered. An elevator, his fiancée by his side, and then his ex appears, holding a little boy with his eyes. In that moment, everything he controlled slips through his fingers. Secrets, lies, and a past he thought he'd buried collide. Will he fight for power or fight for the family he never knew he had? Watch till the end, because this is not just a story. It's a reckoning. Welcome back to Heart-Woven Tales. I'm Selena, and I hope you're doing well. I'd love to know, where are you connecting with me from today? And while you're here, how would you rate my stories out of 10? Be honest. I love hearing your thoughts. And now, please don't skip. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and let's dive into today's story. Ronan Vale moved through life with the precision of a man who refused to let anything slip beyond his grip. Control wasn't just a principle for him, it was a language, a discipline, the very foundation on which he'd engineered every layer of his empire. Standing inside the mirrored elevator of the Vale Empire Tower, he could see his reflection from every angle. Composed posture, unreadable expression, tailored suit sharper than the skyline behind him. Liana stood at his side, elegant and poised, her presence curated to match the image he projected to the world. She glanced at him occasionally, not out of affection but out of awareness. She liked being seen next to the man everyone feared and admired. And for once, Ronan allowed himself to feel the stillness of a morning that seemed predictable, controlled, almost too smooth. But even he didn't notice how brittle that illusion had become until the elevator chimed softly, the doors gliding open like the breath before a storm. The moment the doors parted, his entire world jerked off its axis. A woman stood at the threshold, frozen mid-step as if she'd walked straight into a nightmare she'd spent years outrunning. Arya. Her name didn't pass Ronan's lips, but it detonated inside him with the force of a memory he thought he'd buried too deep to ever resurface. She wasn't alone. A small boy stood in front of her, his tiny fingers curled around her wrist, his eyes, a sharp, startling shade of storm gray, locking onto Ronan's with an instinctive recognition that hit harder than any bullet. The child blinked once, studying Ronan not with fear but with a quiet, curious focus, as if trying to understand why the man in front of him looked so much like himself. Behind the boy's expression, Arya's face tightened, not with guilt, but with the silent desperation of someone bracing for consequences she'd spent 4 years trying to avoid. And in that brief, breathless moment, Liana's posture changed completely. Her spine stiffened, her grip on Ronan's arm slackened, and her polished composure cracked just enough to reveal the shock she couldn't swallow. Arya stepped inside only because the elevator's automated sensors forced the doors to stay open, refusing to close on living bodies. The steel box that moments ago felt spacious suddenly shrank, the air thickening as if the walls leaned in to trap them all inside, a truth none of them were prepared to acknowledge. Ronan's throat tightened, not in fear, but in a rare sense of being blindsided, a sensation he despised more than betrayal itself. The elevator door slid shut behind Arya and her son, sealing them all inside a space that felt less like a lift and more like a detonator waiting for someone to breathe wrong. Arya didn't make eye contact. She held her son close, her hand placed protectively on his shoulder, her body angled slightly away from Ronan as if the force of their history could burn her if she faced him fully. But that avoidance only sharpened the intensity. Ronan couldn't look anywhere else. The mirrored walls doubled their reflections, multiplying every stolen glance, every suppressed emotion, every hint of tension that vibrated through the cramped silence. Liana's eyes flicked from Arya to the child, her mind racing faster than her expression could hide. She wasn't stupid. She wasn't oblivious. She saw the resemblance instantly, The boy's eyes, the shape of his jaw, the way he stood with his feet slightly apart like he was unconsciously mirroring Ronan's stance. The recognition hit her like a slap, and though she didn't speak, the slight tremble in her fingers betrayed the panic she was fighting to keep contained. Ronan remained frozen, not because he was paralyzed, but because every instinct inside him demanded he stay still long enough to understand exactly what he was staring at. The boy kept watching him, head tilted slightly, not afraid, not shy, just quietly observant, as if he felt the weight of something important pressing between them. And with each passing second, the tension climbed, coiling tighter, threatening to snap into something irreversible. Ronan's pulse hammered once, hard, before settling into a dangerously steady rhythm. He was a man who always asked the right questions at the right time, but right now, none of them made it past the iron wall of disbelief pressing against his ribs. He didn't speak, not because he had nothing to say, but because one wrong word could fracture the fragile balance holding the elevator together. Aria's breathing grew shallow, almost imperceptible, but her eyes, those eyes that once softened for him, were filled with a quiet apology and an even quieter warning. She knew what this moment meant. She knew this wasn't just an awkward run-in or an unexpected collision with the past. This was a revelation that demanded consequences, the kind of consequences Ronan Vale never handled gently. The elevator hummed softly as it descended, but the sound only highlighted the suffocating silence, burying every person inside. The tension didn't ease, it thickened. Every floor they passed felt like another layer of truth pressing down on Ronan's chest. Liana shifted slightly, not stepping away from him but creating just enough space to show she was no longer standing with unquestioning confidence. Her eyes hardened with something sharp. Fear, suspicion, humiliation, the poisonous mix that came when a woman realized her place in a powerful man's life might not be as secure as she believed. Aria felt it too. She didn't look at Liana, but she sensed the crack forming, sensed the hostility rising, sensed the storm that could erupt if any of them spoke prematurely. The small boy tugged lightly at his mother's sleeve, just a tiny gesture, but it sent a ripple through Ronan's composure. The innocence in that movement contrasted brutally with the knowledge hanging in the air. The elevator paused briefly at a passing floor but didn't stop, the soft jolt sending a faint tremor through the metal walls, just enough to make everyone's breath hitch in unison. Ronan's jaw tightened, and in that microscopic moment, his control, the one thing he prided himself on, began to show its first crack. He didn't let it break, but the pressure behind it grew dangerous. The boy blinked again, his gaze unwavering, as if silently asking a question neither of his parents had the courage to voice. Aria held him a little tighter, and Ronan felt the impact of that protective gesture like a blow. By the time the elevator neared the lobby, Ronan understood something with brutal clarity. This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't something he could ignore or delay. Whether he wanted it or not, the truth had stepped into his world, breathed his air, and stared him in the eye. His reality was no longer the one he'd engineered. It was shifting, tilting, threatening to collapse under the weight of the past he thought he'd outrun. And as the elevator slowed, preparing to open again, the air tightened so sharply it felt like a noose drawing closer around all of them. The elevator chimed, the doors began to part, but before they fully opened, Ronan caught one final look at Aria, a look filled with fear, defiance, and a truth she'd never intended to reveal. His pulse surged in response, and for the first time in years, Ronan Vale felt something dangerously close to losing control. And that was the moment he realized the real explosion hadn't happened yet. The doors opened, but no one moved, because every one of them knew the next breath could shatter the last piece of silence holding this moment together. The elevator doors remained open, but the four of them stood suspended in the kind of silence that could bury a city, Arya could feel the walls closing in, not physically, but in the way fate sometimes cornered a person with nowhere left to run. She had managed 4 long years of invisibility, 4 years of keeping her son hidden from the shadows Ronan commanded, 4 years of rerouting her life around his empire, the way terrified civilians avoid active landmines. Yet here she was, standing in the lobby of the one tower she had promised herself she would never step foot in again. The cool air of the lobby felt sharp against her skin, and she instinctively pulled Caleb closer, not because she doubted his safety in this moment, but because she knew what it meant for Ronan to look at the boy and see the truth written in features a child could never hide. That truth had weight, danger, consequences she had fought like hell to protect him from. But the universe didn't care about her careful plans. Not today. Arya stepped out first because someone had to move, and she refused to let Ronan be the one to decide her pace. Her heartbeat thrummed violently in her chest, each step pushing her deeper into a building that represented everything she had escaped. Caleb's small hand tightened around hers, grounding her just enough to keep moving. Ronan followed, slow and deliberate, every step measured like he was dissecting the moment with that cold, razor-sharp mind of his. Lyanna walked beside him, but slightly behind, no longer holding his arm, her silence louder than any accusation she could have spoken. Arya could feel Lyanna's gaze burning into the back of her head, a cocktail of disbelief, anger, humiliation, but none of it mattered compared to the pressure building around the man she'd once loved, the man now staring at Caleb as if the child were a riddle he'd been forced to solve. The lobby stretched wide with marble floors, high ceilings, and the quiet hum of powerful people moving through their morning routines. But to Arya, the world felt narrowed to a tunnel. Her son's diagnosis, the looming deadline for treatment, the terrifying truth she'd kept buried, all of it pressed into her lungs like she couldn't draw a full breath. Caleb looked up at her, his innocent gaze unaware of the storm surrounding him. Arya bent slightly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead, trying to steady herself with the simplicity of a mother's instinct. But simplicity didn't exist here, not under this roof, not with Ronan standing behind her, absorbing every detail, every flicker of emotion she failed to hide. Ronan stepped closer, closing the distance with the quiet force of a man who had never allowed anything important to be withheld from him. His presence alone was enough to send a tremor through Arya's spine. She straightened, but didn't turn. She already knew the question hanging in the air, the one she had spent 4 years preparing, never to answer. She felt the weight of it before he even spoke. When his voice finally cut through the silence, it did so with devastating precision, low, controlled, but carrying a force that could crack stone. "Arya," he said, and her name sounded like both a demand and a memory. She didn't respond. She kept her eyes on her son because looking at Ronan meant acknowledging a truth that would change everything. Caleb shifted slightly, unaware of the tension coiling around the adults like barbed wire. Ronan's next words were the kind of words that made the air around them snap tight. "Is he mine?" It wasn't a shout or an accusation. It was a blade, sharp enough to cut past every excuse, every escape route she'd built. Arya felt her throat close, her chest tightening so fast she couldn't catch her breath. She'd rehearsed a dozen denials over the years, imagined every possible scenario in which Ronan might one day ask that question. But none of those rehearsals survived the reality of his voice, the intensity in his eyes, the undeniable resemblance standing at her side. She opened her mouth to speak, but her vocal cords knotted, her body betraying both her fear and her truth. Caleb glanced between them, sensing something he didn't understand but feeling the shift all the same. The silence stretched long enough to become a confession on its own. Arya swallowed hard, her pulse roaring in her ears, and when the word finally slipped from her lips, it came out as barely more than breath. Yes. The single syllable shattered whatever fragile structure had been keeping the moment intact. It was quiet but catastrophic. Liana exhaled sharply, a wounded sound she tried and failed to suppress. Her hand slipped from Ronan's arm as if she'd just touched something burning. The betrayal didn't strike her because she'd been lied to. Ronan had never promised her a fairy tale, but because she had believed she understood her position in his world. Clearly she didn't. Ronan didn't turn toward her. His focus remained fixed on Arya and the boy who carried his blood. Ronan didn't lash out. He didn't raise his voice. His stillness was far more dangerous. He held himself like a man grappling with a truth too large to fit into the disciplined compartments of his mind. His jaw tightened, and for a moment something raw flickered in his eyes, an emotion he didn't show to anyone, an emotion Arya had once known intimately. It wasn't anger. It was something far worse. It was the realization that she had kept something from him that he never would have forgiven in anyone else. Caleb tugged at Arya's sleeve again, sensing her trembling. She forced herself to breathe, to keep her posture steady, to not shatter in front of Ronan and Liana and a lobby full of silent observers who pretended not to notice the unfolding chaos. Liana took a small step back, not out of fear, but out of instinctual self-preservation. Arya caught the movement from the corner of her eye, and part of her understood it. Liana hadn't asked for this, hadn't expected to walk into a morning where the man she planned to marry discovered he had a child with another woman. But understanding didn't soften the tension. If anything, it intensified the fracture lines carving through the air. Ronan's silence grew heavier by the second. Arya braced for his reaction. Anger, accusation, cold calculation. But none came. The absence of it was worse. It meant he was thinking. And Ronan Vale thinking in silence had always been more dangerous than Ronan Vale shouting in fury. The lobby felt too bright, too open, too exposed for the truth that now sat between them. Arya wanted to move, to put distance between herself and Ronan's gaze, yet her feet stayed rooted to the marble floor. Caleb pressed against her leg, his small presence both a comfort and a reminder of everything she stood to lose if Ronan decided to pull her into his world again. She felt the lies she had lived with for years begin to unravel thread by thread. She hadn't kept Caleb a secret to hurt Ronan. She had kept him a secret because Ronan's world could swallow innocence whole without blinking. But explanations wouldn't matter now. Not when the truth was standing inches away, shaped like a little boy with storm-gray eyes. Ronan's voice finally returned, low and steady, but carrying so much controlled force that Arya's stomach tightened. "You should have told me." Not a shout, not a threat, just a certainty, a sharp, inevitable truth. Arya's fingers tightened around Caleb's hand, and she forced herself to meet Ronan's gaze. "I did what I had to do." The words shook, but the resolve behind them didn't. Liana looked between them, her expression trapped somewhere between disbelief and the beginnings of anger. She wasn't sure she had the right to release. Caleb watched quietly, his young mind sensing the tension but unable to understand the gravity of what was unfolding. The elevator behind them chimed again, ready to take new passengers, but none of them moved. They stood at the brink of a conversation that could rewrite their lives or destroy them. Arya felt the sting of tears at the back of her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Crying would give Ronan something to interpret, something to use, something to unravel, and she had already given him too much power without meaning to. Ronan took a small step toward her, not enough to touch her, but enough to make her pulse jump. His eyes dropped briefly to Caleb before lifting back to hers with a question that was far more dangerous than the first. A question he didn't voice yet, but one she felt pressing against her like a warning. She knew then that this moment was only the beginning, and the truth she had tried to bury wasn't done unraveling, not even close. And as the lobby doors slid shut behind incoming guests, Arya realized the real consequences of her confession were about to start, because Ronan wasn't walking away. Ronan didn't walk away from the truth Arya had forced into the light. He carried it with him through the night, like a weight he didn't know how to set down. He had spent his entire life categorizing problems: money problems, enemy problems, power problems. But this one didn't fit any of them. This one breathed. This one had his eyes. This one had been hidden from him for 4 years, not by fate, but by the woman he once loved so fiercely that it had felt inevitable, until she disappeared like a ghost he could never track. The elevator scene replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. The trembling in Arya's voice, the quiet way Caleb studied him, the broken shock in Lyanna's posture. Nothing about the moment slipped away from him. It burrowed deeper with every passing hour. And by dawn, the pressure inside him demanded answers he could hold in his hands instead of emotions he refused to feel, which was why, before the sun was fully up, he ordered the DNA test. He stood in the cold, polished hallway of the private clinic with his jaw locked, his expression unreadable to anyone who dared glance his way. He wasn't searching for confirmation out of disbelief. He already knew, instinctively, painfully, that Caleb was his. But Ronan was a man who made decisions based on proof, not emotion. He needed a result that he could not argue with, not even in the darkest part of his own mind. Arya sat in one of the chairs, her body tense, her arms wrapped protectively around Caleb, as if she expected someone to tear him away the moment the test was mentioned. Caleb, still too young to understand the tension compressing the room, played with the zipper of his jacket and occasionally looked up at Ronan with the kind of hesitant curiosity that made something in Ronan's chest constrict. The clinic smelled like antiseptic and quiet dread. No one spoke as the samples were taken. No one exhaled until it was done. The results returned faster than Ronan expected. Too fast in a way that made his heartbeat accelerate despite every effort to stay composed. The doctor opened the envelope with professional neutrality, but Ronan didn't wait for the explanation. He snatched the paper and scanned it with the precision of a man accustomed to analyzing contracts worth billions. One line was all he needed. One line that rearranged the architecture of everything he believed about his future. Caleb Vale. His son, his blood, his legacy, his responsibility. A truth that didn't feel like a shock, but like a revelation so powerful it nearly knocked the breath from him. Ronan lowered the paper slowly, his fingers tightening, around the edges, as the weight of it hit him harder than any bullet ever had. Arya watched him carefully, like she feared his reaction. But she didn't apologize, didn't try to justify anything. She simply held Caleb closer and waited for Ronan to decide what came next. The next part wasn't gentle. Lyanna barged into the clinic without warning, her heels clicking sharply against the floor, her expression carved from ice and disbelief. She had spent the night trying to rationalize her place in Ronan's life, constructing arguments about loyalty, convenience, business alliances, anything that might secure the position she felt slipping through her fingers. She attempted calmness, but her voice cracked under the strain of rejection she hadn't expected this soon in her life. She touched Ronan's arm like she still had a right to, but his body didn't respond. The slight recoil was enough to make her face crumble for a brief, unguarded second. She whispered about the engagement, about promises, about how this didn't have to ruin everything. But Ronan's silence was an answer sharper than cruelty. Lyanna's gaze flicked toward Arya with something poisonous brewing beneath it, and for a heartbeat, the air split with the possibility of a confrontation far uglier than anything the walls of the clinic had witnessed before. Before anything could break, Ronan stepped forward, not toward Lyanna, but toward Arya and Caleb. The movement was small, but it carried a shift that Lyanna couldn't ignore. She stopped talking mid-sentence, her breath catching when she realized Ronan wasn't asking for space. He was choosing where to stand, and he wasn't standing beside her. Her eyes glistened with fury and humiliation, but she swallowed it because even she knew. Challenging Ronan Vale when he had made a decision was an invitation to lose far more than a broken engagement. She walked out, stiff-backed, her shoulders trembling only after she crossed the threshold. Ronan didn't follow. The absence of that single step ended their future more clearly than any spoken words could. Word traveled through the Vale estate faster than truth could settle in Ronan's chest. The family council gathered that afternoon in the conference room with windows overlooking a city they quietly believed they owned. These were the men and women who had supported Ronan's rise, who had shaped him from the shadows and sharpened him like a weapon. They didn't care about his feelings or the boy or Arya's sacrifices. They cared about control, legacy, and the old ways Ronan had begun drifting from long before he admitted it to himself. The moment Ronan walked in with the DNA test result in hand, the room went quiet. Not respectful quiet, calculating quiet. Arya sat beside Caleb on the far end of the room, out of place among the polished table, the power suits, and the predatory gazes. Her spine was straight, her chin lifted, but the rapid beat of her pulse betrayed her fear. Caleb, sitting on her lap, clutched a small toy car, oblivious to the storm brewing around him. The council didn't waste time. Their first demand was cloaked in politeness, but the venom underneath it was unmistakable. They wanted Caleb removed from public view, hidden away until they could determine how his existence could be woven into the Vale narrative without disrupting the Empire's image. They wanted him monitored, trained, shaped into something useful. And Arya? She was a complication they wanted eliminated entirely, financially, socially, geographically. They called her a threat without using the word, and Arya absorbed every suggestion with silent fury simmering beneath her skin. Ronan listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his expression unreadable. The council mistook his silence for agreement. It was their mistake. When Ronan finally stood, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. His voice was low, controlled, but saturated with authority that left no space for negotiation. He informed them that Caleb would not be hidden. He would not be conditioned. He would not be turned into a pawn for their old-world expectations. The council erupted, disbelief morphing into outrage. No Vale heir had ever been raised outside the council's influence, not in generations. But Ronan shut them down with a final statement that silenced even the most hardened advisors. He would protect his son on his own terms, and anyone who opposed him was now an obstacle, not an ally. The council faltered, recognizing the shift in Ronan's tone, a shift that meant he wasn't discussing policy. He was issuing a warning. Arya didn't breathe easy, not even for a moment, because while Ronan battled his family's legacy, she heard something no one else caught. Caleb's heart monitor, clipped discreetly to the inside of his shirt, began to emit a faint but accelerating beep. It wasn't loud enough to interrupt the council's arguments, but it was enough to freeze her blood. She pulled Caleb closer, her hand trembling as she touched his chest and felt the rapid flutter beneath her palm. She whispered his name, her voice tight, and Caleb blinked up at her with confusion, suddenly more tired than he had been minutes ago. Arya's breath hitched, panic rising so fast she felt dizzy. She looked up to find Ronan, but he was still confronting the room, unaware of the danger unfolding right beside him. Arya stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor sharply enough to cut through the noise. Head snapped toward her, irritation ready to ignite, until they saw her face, until they saw her fear. Ronan's attention shifted instantly, his gaze dropping to Caleb and catching the faint beeping at last. A different kind of silence swept through the room, one thick with dread, one that made every cold-blooded council member sit straighter, suddenly aware that this wasn't politics anymore. Caleb leaned weakly against Arya, his breath shallow, his small fingers clutching her shirt as if trying to anchor himself. And in the space of a heartbeat, Ronan's world, the one he had tried to rebuild with logic and control, threatened to collapse again as the beeping grew faster. Before anyone could move, Caleb's eyelids fluttered and his body sagged, leaving Arya's panicked whisper hanging in the air like a warning that the real war was only beginning. Arya didn't feel the floor under her feet when Caleb's knees buckled. She didn't hear the half-formed cry he tried to make before his body sagged in her arms. All she felt was the terrifying weight of his small chest rising too shallowly, too slowly, as if the air had suddenly forgotten him. She didn't call Ronan, she didn't even think of him, because instinct overpowered logic, and instinct told her to run. She shoved through the hallway, clutching her son, while the world blurred into streaks of color and noise, and by the time she reached the cold night air outside, her lungs were already burning. The hospital was only 6 blocks away, but every step felt like crossing a battlefield barefoot, her heart pounding with the sickening realization that her biggest fear was no longer Ronan's world. It was losing Caleb before he ever got a chance to outrun any of it. She sprinted through the sliding ER doors, shouting for help, her hands trembling so violently that a nurse had to pry Caleb from her grip. And the moment they placed him on a gurney, Arya's composure finally shattered enough for her knees to hit the floor. She didn't know that, across the street, hidden in the shadows, Ronan's men were watching everything unfold with growing alarm, already reaching for their radios. Ronan was in the middle of a council meeting, still braced against the backlash of revealing Caleb's existence when the call came through. 3 clipped words from his most trusted guard. The boy collapsed. Everything else vanished. The room, the council, the politics, even Lyanna's cool stare, all of it became irrelevant noise as Ronan strode out without permission, without a plan, without a single thought except getting to his son before anything else stole time from him. The drive was a blur of red traffic lights ignored and security vehicles scrambling to keep up. When he stormed through the ER entrance, every person in the vicinity instinctively moved aside, not because they recognized the Mafia air, but because something about the way he moved radiated the kind of desperation that belonged to a father, not a kingpin. He didn't wait for authorization. He followed the sound of footsteps and frantic voices until he saw Arya standing outside a treatment room, hands shaking, eyes red, backbone stiff only because collapsing would mean surrendering to a fear she couldn't afford. Ronan didn't ask for permission. He pushed into the room just as Caleb's small chest hitched unevenly under the oxygen mask. The doctor in charge attempted to stop him, but one glance at Ronan's expression turned the man's protest into a nervous swallow. When the doctor finally approached with the results, his tone was grave enough to freeze everyone in place. Caleb's heart wasn't just weak. The stress had triggered a dangerous arrhythmic rhythm, and surgery could no longer be postponed. The only silver lining came with its own sting. Children with strong paternal genetic matches often stabilized faster and tolerated the surgical strain better. Ronan understood the implication immediately. The doctor wasn't making small talk. He was telling him Caleb needed him not in name, not in theory, but biologically, actively, constantly. That requirement hit Arya harder than anyone expected. Her shoulders curled in as if trying to shield herself from a blow, and her voice wavered when she confessed she'd never told Ronan about the pregnancy, because the last time she was in his orbit, his enemies had tried to use her as leverage, and she escaped only by disappearing before they could finish what they started. She didn't hide their son out of cruelty. She hid him because she thought it was the only way to keep him alive. Ronan didn't roar or break anything. The silence he gave her was far worse. It was the kind of silence born from a man replaying every single decision that led them here and realizing how many of them now looked like calculated mistakes instead of strategic victories. He didn't argue with her confession because he remembered too well the violence that once nearly swallowed her, and he recognized the truth in her fear, even if it carved something brutal into his chest. But when he stepped closer to Caleb, watching the small fingers twitch weakly under the monitors, something inside Ronan rewired with frightening clarity. He had power, reach, influence, an army of loyal soldiers, Yet none of it mattered if his son couldn't take a full breath. For the first time in his life, Ronan felt weaker than the smallest enemy in the room: time. And standing beside him, Arya saw that shift happen, saw the man she'd once known rearrange himself around a truth he could no longer outrun. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an apology. It was something far more dangerous: resolve. But just when the tension in the room reached a fragile equilibrium, the monitors beside Caleb flickered, emitting a slow, uneven beep that made the doctor rush back inside with a sharply drawn breath. Arya's hand flew to her mouth. Ronan's pulse spiked. The nurse moved to adjust the oxygen flow, muttering something under her breath about arrhythmia spikes. For one terrifying moment, the room felt too small, too bright, too cold, like fate itself was holding its breath, waiting for someone to break first. And in that split second of suspended dread, Ronan realized this wasn't just a medical emergency or a past resurfacing. It was the beginning of a war he had no choice but to fight, because the beeping wasn't just unstable. It was accelerating, and something was very, very wrong. 5. The moment Ronan left the hospital with Caleb safe in his arms, a clarity struck him so violently that every decision he had been clinging to for years suddenly felt like dust. The engagement, the alliances, the calculated arrangements of his empire, all of it was expendable if it threatened his son's life. He didn't hesitate. Lyanna's calls, her messages, the carefully rehearsed conversations she might have had with him, all were meaningless. By morning, he had canceled the engagement quietly but decisively. There was no confrontation, no dramatic scene in the media, no apology to soften the edges. Lyanna, however, hadn't anticipated the quiet finality of his decision. When she arrived at his office later, expecting at least a confrontation that could be leveraged, she found only empty chairs and papers cleared off the desk where she imagined herself seated in influence. She exploded in fury, her words sharp, calculated, trying to cut him, to remind him of the humiliation he had inflicted by choosing a child over a fiancé. But Ronan didn't flinch. Her fury bounced off him like bullets against reinforced steel. He had never married for love, only for strategy, and Lyanna had been a strategic decision, not a necessity. The next few days were a whirlwind of ruthless efficiency, a storm that only those inside the empire could recognize. Every operation that might endanger Caleb's life was severed overnight. Shipment routes were altered, rival gangs warned off, and every intelligence channel recalibrated to anticipate attacks before they could happen. Enemies of the Vale Empire felt a sudden shift in the air, an unmistakable crack in what they thought was Ronan's impenetrable dominance. They misread it, assuming weakness, assuming distraction. But what they didn't realize was that Ronan's focus had sharpened to a razor's edge, guided by a single purpose: protect his son at all costs. The empire that had once revolved around leverage and profit now pivoted around a heartbeat, a fragile pulse that had upended everything he believed about power. He studied the city from his office window at night, Caleb asleep in a quiet room in the heart of the house, and for the first time, power felt like a weapon in service to life, not fear. Arya's decision to step into Ronan's house wasn't easy. Every instinct told her to stay away, to retreat from a world she had spent years navigating alone. But Caleb's presence demanded it. He needed both of them, whether she admitted it or not. The first time she crossed the threshold of the Vale estate again, every memory of past danger rose to meet her. Hidden cameras, silent threats, men watching from shadows. But she pushed forward, letting nothing show on her face. Caleb clung to her hand, his small steps surprisingly steady for a child, aware of the gravity surrounding him. When she finally saw Ronan, standing in the dim light of the hallway, half in shadow, half illuminated by the glow of the city beyond the windows, her heart constricted. the man who once held everything. She loved in his cold, calculated hands now looked fragile in a way only parenthood could expose. Something in her chest loosened, something in him softened. Walls built over years of fear began to crumble without either of them noticing fully. Their late-night argument came from the first honesty they had shared in years. Words spilled, not carefully measured, not strategic, but raw. Ronan confessed the constant war inside him between being a father and being a boss, between survival and vulnerability. Arya admitted the terror of raising Caleb alone, of hiding him in a world too dangerous for a child. The conversation wound around the room like a living thing, touching corners of fear, shame, desire, and longing that neither had admitted to in decades. At moments, Caleb stirred in his sleep, small noises punctuating the tension and reminding them both that this conversation wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the boy whose very existence demanded they reconcile truths they had fought to bury. Each pause in their words carried the weight of unspoken fears, every glance sharp enough to cut through years of avoidance. And yet, beneath the tension, there was a fragile understanding beginning to form, a tentative truce anchored in necessity, and the unyielding presence of a child who demanded their attention. But even as they reached that precarious understanding, the world outside remained relentless. Ronan had long assumed that his enemies only threatened his wealth or reputation, that danger came through predictable channels. Tonight proved him wrong. Through the faint glare of the streetlights and the soft hum of the city, someone lingered in the shadows, watching the large windows of the estate. The scope of the threat revealed itself slowly. The deliberate positioning of a rifle, a laser dot flickering faintly across the glass, the way the figure held steady in patience rather than recklessness. Arya noticed it first, instinctively tightening her grip on Caleb and stepping closer to Ronan, heart hammering, voice barely a whisper. "Someone's here," she breathed. Ronan's eyes followed hers, narrowing immediately as his mind cataloged every possible angle, every possible exit, every way the situation could unravel in seconds. Ronan moved with purpose, shielding Caleb instinctively, the old boss inside him merging seamlessly with the new father. He calculated trajectories, window angles, line of sight, likely shooter skill sets. Arya, unused to witnessing him so focused in this capacity, felt a thrill of fear and awe at once. Every muscle in his body radiated lethal precision, and yet every glance he cast at Caleb carried something entirely different: tenderness, protection, love. The walls of the house became both a battlefield and a sanctuary, a fragile place where every footstep, every shadow, every flicker of light mattered. The late-night tension wasn't just about unresolved arguments or hidden emotions anymore. It was a tangible threat pressing against them, reminding Ronan that the only battle he truly could not lose was the one he fought to keep his son alive. The night stretched on, and words ceased entirely as both adults calculated and observed. Caleb slept fitfully, his small chest rising and falling in uneven rhythm, and Arya refused to leave his side, feeling every heartbeat as if it were a warning. Ronan adjusted the blinds, checked the locks, signaled silently to his men stationed discreetly around the estate, each motion precise, calm, deadly. And yet, despite the strategy, despite the preparation, the truth remained undeniable. Someone had found them. Someone wanted more than power. They wanted a strike at Ronan's heart, at the very life that now defined him. Each minute stretched unbearably, each shadow outside the window a dagger poised to pierce their fragile sanctuary. And in the quiet tension of that night, both Ronan and Arya realized that the war had already begun. And it was closer than they could see, closer than they could anticipate. A sudden flicker of movement caught Arya's eye, small but deliberate. The laser dot disappeared. Her breath hitched, and she leaned instinctively toward Ronan, He moved before she could even speak, stepping to shield Caleb fully, eyes scanning, muscles coiled, ready to strike. The threat hadn't acted yet, but the fact it existed, silent, patient, precise, was more terrifying than any confrontation they had ever faced. This night would not end quietly. Not for them. Not for Caleb. The battle, silent and invisible as it might seem, had already begun. The moment stretched taut as the dark figure outside shifted ever so slightly, and in that instant Ronan understood. The next heartbeat could decide everything. The house had settled into a deceptive calm after hours of anticipation, a silence that felt like it could fracture at the slightest provocation. Caleb, finally lulled into an uneasy sleep, rested against Ronan's chest as the man sat in, a chair in the dim glow of the living room. Arya hovered nearby, her hands twitching with the impulse to do something, anything, to protect him further, though she knew her presence was largely symbolic. Every creak of the old wood floors, every whisper of wind against the windows, set her nerves ablaze. She couldn't stop scanning the outside darkness for the faintest indication of danger, for the shadow of a gunman whose presence had already been proven. Ronan, aware of her gaze but focused entirely on Caleb, didn't flinch. His body was a fortress, his hands firm around his son, his instincts wired to respond faster than any human should be able to. Every muscle was coiled, ready for the inevitable strike, and yet there was a tenderness in the way he adjusted Caleb's blanket and brushed a stray hair from his forehead that made Arya's chest ache. For a moment time slowed, and the only sounds were the soft breaths of a child, the distant hum of the city, and the quiet click of the clock on the mantelpiece. It was in this fragile, fleeting calm that the first shot shattered everything. Glass exploded outward, raining shards across the room, and the scream that followed was a mixture of pure terror and reflexive instinct. Ronan reacted before thought, diving forward and pressing Caleb into his chest with every ounce of his strength. Shards cut through the air, embedding themselves in walls, furniture, and, shockingly, his own arm. He barely felt the pain. Not until he had positioned his son safely behind the nearest barrier did the searing awareness hit. His men were already moving, weapons drawn, cutting down the gunmen in an orchestrated dance of speed and lethality that had taken years to perfect. Even so, the chaos felt like it might devour them whole. Arya's scream tore through the hallways, echoing into the corners of the estate as she stumbled toward the living room, only to find Ronan standing there, half-bloodied, chest heaving, yet unyielding. The sight stopped her breath. She had expected devastation, defeat, or at least panic, but instead she saw a man who had absorbed the impact, shouldered the violence, and remained a protector above all else. Her knees nearly buckled as the flood of emotions hit her. Fear, relief, admiration, and an old, buried longing that she had spent years denying. She reached for him instinctively, but paused, realizing she couldn't step into the role she had abandoned without acknowledgement. And then, in a moment that felt almost cruelly timed by fate itself, Caleb stirred, eyes wide but secure against Ronan's chest, and the tiny hands lifted briefly to brush against his father's face, grounding him even as danger still lingered outside the shattered glass. It was then, in the aftermath of the first strike, that Arya allowed herself the admission she had buried so deeply. She still loved him. The words didn't come out loud, they didn't need to, but the tension in her body, the tremor in her hands, the way she watched him bleed and yet stand unbroken, all conveyed the confession more honestly than any sentence could. She had convinced herself over the years that she could survive without him, that she could protect Caleb without pulling Ronan back into their lives. But the raw display of his protective instincts, his unwavering focus, and his undeniable presence shattered every wall she had built. And as she stared, She felt a strange courage rising, a willingness to step into the chaos alongside him, to accept danger if it meant keeping her son safe. Ronan, bleeding from a deep cut that traced down his forearm, felt something crack open inside him. The pain was real, sharp, reminding him that he was mortal, but it was secondary to the clarity he now had about what mattered. For 4 years, he had tried to bury every memory of Arya, to convince himself that strategy, empire, and control could replace the void she left. He had failed. Every calculated decision had been meaningless in comparison to the small, steady heartbeat in his arms. The truth he had avoided, the one he had refused to admit even to himself, emerged fully in the midst of chaos. He had never stopped loving her. He had never stopped noticing her, missing her, craving the rare moments when she had touched his life with light and honesty. And now, watching her stand near the edge of panic yet anchored by determination, he voiced it simply, harshly, unflinchingly. He had tried to forget her for 4 years, and he had failed utterly. They didn't embrace. Not yet. This wasn't a romantic reunion crafted in gentle moments. It was forged in fire, in glass shards, in the terror of near loss. Their eyes locked, a silent understanding passing between them, raw and unpolished, carved from fear, regret, and unspoken apologies. Caleb, sensing the intensity, tightened his grip on Ronan's shirt, grounding them both in the tangible present. The house, scarred and trembling from the first attack, held its breath alongside them. They were not safe. They were never safe. And yet, for the first time in years, Arya felt a fierce, stubborn hope, a recognition that while their lives were fragmented, they were capable of facing the storm together if only they could survive it. But the storm was far from over. Outside, hidden in darkness beyond the shattered windows, the real threat had not yet revealed itself. The first gunman had been eliminated, yes, but the presence of someone more cunning, patient, and lethal lingered. The flicker of a laser across the remaining glass, the sound of a cautious step in the distance, the faint hum of a suppressed weapon, all of it warned that the danger was deliberate, intelligent, and far from finished. Ronan adjusted Caleb in his arms, shielding him instinctively, and scanned every shadow. Arya moved beside him, unafraid now but tense, prepared to act if necessary. Every second stretched painfully, each movement outside the window a reminder that the person aiming at them wasn't just seeking revenge, they were hunting with precision, patience, and purpose. Every heartbeat in the room pulsed with the threat of violence. Ronan's mind worked rapidly, cataloging exits, angles, and contingencies. Every hand, every movement, every sound mattered. Caleb stirred again, small eyes blinking against the faint overhead light, and Arya whispered reassurances to both father and son, though her voice betrayed her fear. The tension coiled tighter with each passing moment, thickening until it seemed almost visible in the air. And then, a faint shadow moved again, deliberate and slow, a presence so quiet it could almost be dismissed, if one weren't trained, experienced, and deadly like Ronan Vale. He didn't flinch. He simply prepared, body coiled, ready to intercept the next strike before it could even arrive. Arya's hands tightened on Caleb's small shoulders, her nails digging into his jacket, sensing that whatever came next would decide more than just survival. It could define the fragile bond they were only just beginning to rebuild. Every instinct screamed at them both. The night was far from over, and the person behind the attack had not yet shown their face. The first strike had been a warning. The second could be lethal. And in that terrifying moment, Ronan understood fully that protecting Caleb wasn't just a priority. It was the only battle that could never be surrendered. Every calculation, every decision, every ounce of experience he had amassed over a lifetime boiled down to a single goal: keep his son alive. And for the first time, Arya saw not the unyielding Mafia boss, but the father, vulnerable, precise, unstoppable, and wholly devoted to a child who carried his blood, his legacy, and the truth of their shared past. And somewhere in the shadows outside, the real threat lingered, waiting, patient and ruthless, aware that one wrong move inside that room could end everything for all of them. 7. The night had left its mark on the city, and on the Vale estate, the faint glow of dawn barely penetrated the broken windows and scattered debris. Ronan stood among the ruins of the living room, his body a map of cuts and bruises, every line on his face a testament to the fight they had just survived. The adrenaline was fading, leaving raw exhaustion behind, but he could not yet breathe. The threat lingered, not in the shadows of the house anymore, but in the knowledge of who had orchestrated it. Every instinct Ronan possessed, honed over decades of navigating violence and betrayal, screamed at him that this was no random strike. The subtle signatures, the precision of the shots, the intelligence behind the attack, it all pointed to someone who knew him intimately, someone who had once trusted him, someone whose motives were personal, relentless, and tied to the bloodlines he now fought to protect. The investigation revealed the truth with a clarity that was both infuriating and inevitable. The man behind the attack was a relic of the old guard, a once loyal lieutenant of Ronan's father who had never forgiven him for redefining the Empire, for daring to imagine a world where power could coexist with restraint, and for refusing to continue the cycle of fear and violence that had defined the family for generations. He saw Caleb, innocent yet carrying Ronan's blood, as a threat to the old ways, a dilution of the empire that had been built with sweat, fire, and unflinching ruthlessness. Every step of his plan had been meticulous: observation, the first shot, the calculated fear, the hope that it would unbalance Ronan long enough to remove the boy from the equation. But he had miscalculated. He had underestimated the one battle Ronan would never surrender, the one responsibility that superseded all others: his son. Ronan didn't negotiate. He didn't send messages. He didn't consider compromise. He hunted. Every move he made was precise, cold, and unavoidable, leaving a trail that forced the attacker into a corner he had not foreseen. By the time Ronan confronted him, it was not a discussion but a reckoning. Years of strategy, intuition, and sheer will converged in a moment that was brief, violent, and decisive. The man had once wielded influence like a weapon. Now he wielded nothing. Ronan walked away unflinching, his body aching, his mind steeled not by triumph, but by relief. The threat had been neutralized. Caleb, the reason for every sleepless night, every calculated move, every sacrifice had survived, and nothing else mattered. By the time Ronan returned to the hospital, the weight of exhaustion pressed against him like gravity. His steps were measured, but determined, each one a bridge back to the fragile, luminous world of fatherhood he had fought so hard to reclaim. Arya met him at the entrance, eyes wide with apprehension and admiration, recognizing the toll he had endured, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. The sight of him bloody and weary, yet fiercely protective, struck her with the force of undeniable truth. This was a man who had chosen change, not because circumstance forced it, but because he wanted it. He had embraced fatherhood, protection, and a new kind of strength entirely on his own terms, reshaping himself around the life he now refused to let go. Caleb's recovery was slow, measured in hours and moments that stretched both painfully and beautifully. Ronan remained at his side for every step, every sigh, every twitch of the small body that was now the center of his existence. He watched his son sleep, eyes tracing the curve of his cheek, the small hands that had once held only a toy car now capable of gripping a father's shirt with instinctive trust. Arya stayed close, silent but present, observing him with a mixture of awe and something that felt dangerously like hope. She saw the cracks in his stoicism, the tenderness that had been hidden under layers of control, and she understood that this man, this same Ronan Vale who had once commanded empires and feared nothing, had become something wholly new. A father, fiercely human and irrevocably connected to the child he had once refused to acknowledge. When Caleb finally stirred, blinking against the soft hospital light, the world seemed to pause. His small voice, fragile and tentative, called out with a word so simple it carried weight heavier than any declaration or contract. Dad. The sound shattered the last of Ronan's defenses. For the first time in his life, he let himself break, not in defeat, but in release. Release of fear, release of longing, release of all the years spent denying what he had always felt. He gathered Caleb in his arms, holding him close as if he could imprint his presence onto every fiber of the child's being. Arya's breath caught in her throat, tears forming unbidden, because in that embrace she saw the culmination of every choice, every risk, every fear she had endured. They were finally together, irrevocably, not by accident, not by convenience, but by the messy, beautiful chaos of their shared lives. The conversation that followed was quiet, not filled with promises or perfection, but with a clarity that had eluded them for years. Ronan spoke first, voice low and steady, admitting every failure, every avoidance, every desperate attempt to live without Arya and Caleb. Arya responded with honesty, revealing the terror, the solitude, and the unwavering love that had kept her moving forward even when the world seemed set against her. They didn't need to reconcile fully in words. Their actions, their presence, their shared care of Caleb spoke louder than any confession could. The past remained complicated, full of mistakes and regrets, but the present, this fragile, fragile present, was theirs to claim. As the hours passed, Ronan, Arya, and Caleb settled into a rhythm, small and intimate. They shared meals in quiet rooms, laughter in brief moments that pierced the heaviness, and whispered conversations that stitched the torn fabric of their lives back together, thread by careful thread. Ronan watched Arya adjust Caleb's blanket, feeling a warmth he had denied himself for years, and for the first time, he imagined a future not dominated by empire or vengeance, but by presence, care, and the ordinary miracles of a family. He realized that true strength was no longer measured by power, but by the ability to love, to protect, and to remain steady even when everything else threatened collapse. Finally, when Caleb fell asleep once more, Ronan and Arya shared a long look across the hospital room. No words were necessary. The unspoken promise hung in the air. They would face the future together, imperfect and uncertain, but unwavering. The city outside continued to pulse with life and danger, but inside that room, they were a fortress, a unit, a family born not from convenience or strategy, but from survival, courage, and the fierce, unrelenting bond of blood and love. And when, hours later, the elevator doors closed, in their home once more, it was no longer a symbol of missed connections or fractured pasts. This time, it was a threshold of unity. The three of them stood together, Ronan's hands on Caleb's small shoulders, Arya close enough to brush against them both, and the weight of old mistakes finally lifted, if only slightly, from their shoulders. The past had been messy. The path forward would be uncertain. But in that quiet moment, with the soft rhythm of a recovering child, a father who had finally broken and a mother who had returned to claim her place, they were unshakable. Not because the world had changed, not because enemies were gone, but because they had chosen each other. And for the first time, the Vale name carried a meaning beyond empire or power. It carried love, protection, and a family forged from the ruins of old choices. Wow, what a journey. I hope you felt every twist, every heartbeat, and every emotion just like I did while telling it. I'd love to hear from you. What was your favorite moment, and how would you rate this story out of 10? Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, because there are many more heartfelt tales coming your way. Thank you for being part of Heartwoven Tales, and I'll see you in the next story.